And it was never just about Ukraine. Russia has always aimed to break the West and Europe in particular.
Ukraine's president says that Moscow is testing Europe's red lines. Unidentified drones are being spotted at some of the busiest airports and military sites in the EU. That's as the bloc pours billions of dollars into its defences. So are Europe and Russia close to a confrontation? And is either side ready for conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. After nearly 4 years of war between Kyiv and Moscow, fighting is heating up on the front lines of eastern Ukraine. But with drones spotted at sensitive sites across the European Union, its leaders have declared that Russia is fighting a hybrid war beyond Ukraine's borders. They say the bloc will protect every centimetre of its territory as member states scale up military spending to heights not seen for decades. And although only Ukraine and Russia are officially at war, the continent has now entered an arms race that's reshaping its economies, rattling governments, and reframing relationships within the European Union. All of this comes as Ukraine is losing territory to Russia, 1 kilometre at a time. So, is war really edging closer to Europe's borders, and is the continent prepared? We'll put those questions to our guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Imogen Kimber.
Brussels Airport, brought to a standstill for several hours because of drone sightings. Belgian officials said it looked like Russia was to blame, but they couldn't be sure. Drones were also seen near Brussels' nuclear plant and military sites. In October and September, Gothenburg, Munich and Copenhagen Airport also closed for several hours due to drone sightings. And Finland, Moldova, Romania and Estonia's airspace was violated. Russian drones were also shot down in Polish airspace. The Prime Minister Donald Tusk described it as the closest the country had been to open conflict since World War II. Moscow denies any involvement, with President Vladimir Putin even joking about it.
Не буду больше ни во Францию, ни в Данию, ни в Копенгаген. Куда еще долетают на эти самые?
But European leaders are taking the sightings seriously. French, German and British military equipment and personnel have arrived in Belgium to counter drone attacks. And there's a plan to build a drone wall. That's layers of detection and interception systems that will be part of the Eastern Flank Watch, a joint initiative by NATO and the European Union.
There is a hybrid war going on in Europe right now. It is part of rearming ourselves. I think we have to focus, of course, on the cyber attacks and the risk of sabotage and anti-drone capacities.
Russia says the wall will create divisions.
The construction of walls is always a bad sign, as history shows. What we're seeing is a continued militaristic posture instead of thinking about how to engage in a dialogue to jointly seek security guarantees within that dialogue.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy says Russia may open a second front against another European country.
These are all tests of Europe, tests of their reaction, all these drone attacks by Putin, testing what they are capable of, testing how America will react to the threat of undermining European countries as well as NATO.
NATO is under pressure, with its biggest contributor, the US, threatening to reduce funding if Europeans don't increase their defence budgets, although many of them have. European countries have also been bolstering their military presence on Europe's border with Russia by sending troops. And the bloc says it will be ready for war by 2030, but critics argue that's not soon enough. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From Moscow, we're joined by Alexander Bratesky, a political analyst and independent journalist. From Birmingham in the UK, we're joined by Stefan Wolf, a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham. And from Geneva, we're joined by Alexandre Vautravers, editor-in-chief of Revue Militaire Suisse. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Alexander in Moscow. Drone incursions, fighter jets in NATO airspace, alleged electoral interference, so-called little green men, soldiers of unconfirmed origin in Estonia, Russia denies, as we heard, that it's responsible, but EU leaders seem to have little doubt that it is. What does Moscow think that it's doing?
Well, as I said, Moscow has, of course, testing the ground of the European military, especially with NATO, which is still a strong alliance despite the Russian claims. In the same time, the cool heads within the Russian political elite, all the military, are sort of like definitely trying to avoid a hardline confrontation. Because when you see, of course, it was played out meeting with President Putin and his senior officials about the blast at Novaya Zemlya, of the nuclear blast, and he said, like, let's actually see how U.S. is prepared and so on. So Putin is still showing himself that he's trying to sort of like abstain from very hard moves. Although, yes, of course, there are a lot of tests, such as drones and all the steps that you have mentioned. We are getting in a very much 1983 situation where there was a very big standoff between the Soviet Union and the NATO, with the Western and Eastern Germany on both sides. So that actually very much reminds us about the Cold War of the past.
Stefan, what do you make of that? What do you think Moscow is doing? What are its aims, its chances of success? How much of a danger does it pose to the EU and NATO?
I think it's actually quite dangerous, and I would say it's a very different ballgame than we had back in the 1980s. I actually grew up in East Germany, so I've seen it from one particular side. And we didn't have anything like the kinds of very provocative moves that the Kremlin is currently making against NATO and the European Union. So I think from that perspective, what the Kremlin really tries to do is to test the resolve of NATO, to test the levels of preparedness that we have against these kinds of what are now hybrid attacks, but what could very quickly escalate into proper warfare, if you want. And I think the third issue that the Kremlin really wants to find out here is how European publics are actually responding to that. Are they going to be cowed into this kind of are they going to be cowed into submission by these strategies from Moscow, or are they actually going to rally behind their governments to protect NATO territory, European territory, and that of their allies?
But Stefan, is Russia, as you say, currently testing resolve, or is it already waging some sort of a hybrid war?
Oh, it's absolutely both. One doesn't rule out the other. So, part of the hybrid war is this kind of creation of uncertainty, creation of mistrust, creation of fear in Europe among European publics, uncertainty, wariness of governments, how to respond to that, and what actually would be effective responses. So it's both a direct effort to undermine European resilience, but also gathering vital information and intelligence about how the West would actually respond if this were to turn into an actual hot war between Russia and the West.
Alexandre, are Europe and the NATO alliance prepared to deal with Russian hybrid war tactics? This is not new. Russia's been doing this for quite some time now. Why is the continent only now waking up to the threat? Why has it been so slow?
There's many answers I can give you. Some countries are more ready than others. And Poland, for example, in 2017, has introduced all kinds of measures. Eastern and Baltic states have also introduced very concrete hardware measures, procurement, in order to defend against such hybrid actions that we've talked about earlier. Now, the problem with this hybrid warfare is that it is a kind of warfare that is designed to be used below the threshold of war. And this is one of the areas in which democracies are noticeably challenged because it is not possible, it is not cost effective, it is not legal to put in place military defenses in a situation in which we are below the threshold of war. So definitely, to answer your question, yes, European, not only countries, but alliances are being tested right now.
Alexander, in Moscow, to what extent could Russia's hybrid war tactics become something of a permanent feature of Russia's relations with Europe going forward?
Well, actually, as I see, the Westerners and Russians are still have channels of communications, right? And that actually can sort of like stop, the possibility of war efforts, because as you see, the Russian society, political elite is not monolith as far as all those things is concerned, and President Putin still listens to different people within that inner circle, I would say.
Stefan, we mentioned some of the tactics that Russia is currently employing: drone incursions, fighter jets straying into NATO airspace. This alleged and ongoing interference with elections. I mean, what exactly is a hybrid war? Those are some of the tactics. What others is Russia currently employing?
Well, I think what Russia is doing is sort of using what sometimes is also called full spectrum warfare. Sometimes it's referred to as the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which is exactly all of the things that you have just mentioned, and then some others are on top of that. Let's also not forget that there were Russian attacks, or alleged Russian attacks against undersea infrastructure, in particular in the Baltic Sea, disrupting electricity and communication cables. So all of this is part of what Russia is doing here, always with a level of plausible deniability. So yes, I think our colleague in Moscow is absolutely right that there are still channels of communication, but that doesn't mean that Russia isn't using these channels of communication whilst at the same time carrying out these more or less credibly deniable attacks against Europe, against infrastructure in Europe, aggressively gathering intelligence on military installations and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, I think this is all part of what is referred to as this hybrid war strategy. And I mean, we have to be clear. I mean, this is a kind of warfare now. It's not what's happening in Ukraine on the front lines there and in the air campaign, but it is definitely a level of confrontation that I would say is qualitatively different and more dangerous than what we had, certainly towards the end of the Cold War in the 1980s.
And Stefan, just before we move on, I just want to get one thing straight. Is this a war that is focused at the moment entirely on Europe, or are other parts of the world affected by Russia's tactics too?
I think that's in the eye of the beholder, I would say here. I mean, obviously, I mean, Russia is still a power with certainly global aspirations and with a lot of global reach. So, I mean, we have all kinds of communications now coming out of the Kremlin, for example, in relation to the situation in Venezuela. We have Russian presence and involvement in various parts of Africa. So I think in that sense, there's a closer resemblance to the Cold War here in terms of Russia really trying to spread its influence, again, much more than it had it over the past probably 2 decades or so since the end of the Cold War. But the main center of attention right now clearly is Europe, and is also an effort to undermine the transatlantic relationship, this very close alliance between the United States and Western Europe that has kept the continent out of trouble, if you want, since the end of the Second World War.
Alexandre, how dangerous is this hybrid war for Moscow? To what extent is it playing with fire here? What are the chances of it miscalculating and triggering a full-blown military response? Is this a war that Russia can win, given the size and economic strength of the EU economy, and also, of course, the military strength of the NATO alliance?
Let me say this, it's the only war that Russia can win, and therefore it's today the only option from Moscow to get back in one way against the West. Because economically speaking, there is no way that Russia can compete with Western powers. Militarily speaking, we are talking about Russia, which has introduced supposedly a war economy. It is spending anywhere between 6 and 30% of its GDP on defense. But of course, the GDP of Russia is not the GDP of the major European powers. And so with the recent decisions that were announced early this year of increased defense spending, actually more than a doubling of Europe's defense spending, and very serious measures taken industrially to be able to produce more arms and to produce those arms independently from other suppliers, such as the United States of America, then we need to understand that in terms of conventional military, Russia is not able to challenge not only the West, but even European countries. And hybrid warfare is really the only possibility left in the deck, in the cards of Moscow.
Alexander, after his country, or after drones were intercepted by his country, Poland's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, said that it was the closest we've come to open conflict since the Second World War. Does Moscow, is there any sense, you talked about in your first answer that the caution there in Moscow, is there any sense that Moscow understands that it could be playing with fire here?
It does, because it has powerful allies, let's say India and China, which also have very economic and even some political ties, India, with the US and the West. So those countries will definitely be able to play a role in restraining Russia because it doesn't want to lose its economic partners. So Russia, of course, and also I would say having a hybrid war against another country, you can actually get it on your territory, right? So which is, also, there's two different things that Kremlin is actually considering.
Stefan, how much of this has to do with the ongoing war in Ukraine? To what extent does Moscow need to weaken the West in any way it can in order to succeed in Ukraine? Is Russia's aim to win at all costs, even if that means alienating its European neighbours, who, due to this ongoing hybrid war, are only going to militarize their borders with Russia even further and threaten Russia's security even further?
Well, I wouldn't quite go as far as saying that Europe is going to threaten Russia's security. What Europe clearly will not take, and I think this has been very clear over the past probably 8 to 12 months, is being sort of intimidated by Russia. So what European powers have now realized is that they need to be able to stand on their own 2 feet when it comes to defense. That doesn't mean giving up completely on the relationship across the Atlantic with the United States, but becoming independent, autonomous within this relationship and not having to constantly rely on critical enablers provided by the United States. So I think from that perspective, deterrence really is the new name of the game for Europe, much more so than it was, say, in the past 10, let alone 20 or 30 years since the end of the Cold War.
Alexander, in Geneva, the EU then says that it has a plan to be ready for war by the year 2030. 2030. It's called the Defence Readiness Roadmap 2030, presented to the European Commission last month. It calls for countries to bulk buy weapons and to rely on joint contracts for arms procurement. Economically, does that make sense? How does Europe deal with an ever-changing threat that's using such a variety of tactics? Is the 2030 target that the EU has set itself simply too late?
Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Let me say that all of these ideas that you have listed, all of these ideas have been discussed or are being discussed, and this since the year 2000. This is 20 years, more than 20 years of discussion. The only difference that we have now is a very strong political resolution to put this into practice. And definitely the budgets that go along with these industrial objectives are now present with the doubling of the European countries' defense budgets. So let me just try and give you an optimistic response, if you let me. The transformation of the Russian armed forces and the complete transformation of Russia's defense industry started in 2007, and the objective was to be ready for war within 10 years. Well, we have seen it has taken more or less that time, and we are now 15 years into the realization that Russia is not as ready for war as it wanted to be in 2007. The main decisions with regards to budgets, with regards to industrial production and capabilities in the European Union date back 2024. The objective is 2027. And in 2027, European countries together will be able to produce as much artillery ammunition as Russia today. In other terms, Europeans can do it much quicker and much better. They have been slow to take the situation seriously. They have been slow to decide to commit the budgets necessary. But now we are seeing fast progress in Europe.
Alexander, in Moscow, is Russia here, do you think, trying to go back to the days of the Cold War? Does what it want is a return to that era where it has a sphere of influence over other countries? Is this about economics? Is it about security, or both?
Well, we can't read the mind of President Putin, but what we actually say. By the 2030, we might have a different political leadership, let's say, in the Kremlin, and a new person might actually get back to the negotiating table and even offer some other foreign policy. But at the same time, yes, the military machine will be still working on both sides, both in European Union and Russia. It will be very hard to stop. We also seen that with the year of Gorbachev, when we actually were on a very high brink of real war, or even nuclear war. And I apologize for having. If I can have a concluding remarks on this. Go on.
Stefan, what's your view on that? Why is a sphere of influence so important for Russia? If it succeeds in its aims in Ukraine, if it manages to dissuade European support for Ukraine and it achieves its objectives, will it stop there?
I think that's the big question that everybody is trying to answer. And as many experts as you are asking, as many answers I think you will be getting. I mean, my own personal view is that right now relations between Russia and the West are so bad that we simply cannot assume that even if Putin gets to realize what his stated war aims are in relation to Ukraine, that will be the end of it. Because then you could argue from the Kremlin's perspective, okay, now so we have maybe reestablished some sort of sphere of influence, but in order to protect this sphere of influence, we need a buffer zone. So where is the buffer zone? I mean, is that the rest of Ukraine? Is that Moldova? Is that the South Caucasus? Does that mean maybe weakening NATO allies in the Baltic states? So where does it stop? I think the key issue, and here I agree with our colleague in Moscow, is what we really need is a reset in political relationships between Russia and the West. And I think this is very, very difficult to see in the current context where we have President Putin in the Kremlin, who, of course, has a long history going back at least 20 years, probably even longer, to really having regretted the loss of the Soviet Union, which he once called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So if you take that as your starting point, then very clearly it's not going to end with the war in Ukraine. And that's why not losing this war is so important for both Moscow and the West.
Alexander, do you agree with that? Right back at the beginning of the program, we saw that quote from Vladimir Zelenskyy, who said it was never just about Ukraine. Russia has always aimed to break the West and Europe in particular. Zelenskyy argues that Russia is preparing to open up a second front in this war. He's talking about this hybrid war. It's not just political rhetoric. I think we've established that from someone who needs to keep Europe funding his defenses. But Russia is spending vast amounts of money and blood in Ukraine right now. Can it afford to keep waging a war like this on two fronts?
So you're asking two questions. The answer to the first question, nothing is new on the Eastern Front, because essentially this plan of recreating an area of influence, all of this appeared in foreign policy documents in Russia in the summer of 2000, when Vladimir Putin was first elected as president. And all sorts of measures were taken already then, with the renuclearization of Kaliningrad and so on and so forth, and the reforms of the military, the defense industry that I mentioned before. So nothing is new. I would add to that, nothing is new given the fact that the Russian president was extremely explicit with regards to his demands at the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, with regards to the demilitarization on the behalf of NATO of certain Central European countries. Romania was in particular in the crosshairs, and we could continue speaking about other countries. So nothing is new under the sun, and Russia has been extremely explicit about all of this. With regards to your second question,
very quickly, Alexander, we're almost out of time. Very quickly.
Yes, very quickly, Russia is not going to win militarily this war, this confrontation with Ukraine. And there are now two options. Either you scale down, so you freeze the conflict because there's no more guns, no more bullets, no more money to fight this war. So you cool this down, or you step it up and you create a second front, you create an incident somewhere. And therefore you are able to get people to forget that there ever was a war in Ukraine.
There, gentlemen, I'm afraid we must leave it. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Alexander Bratezki, Stefan Wolf, and Alexandre Vautravers. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again.